Good evening, everybody. We have heard this phrase and used it many times as well. Partners in crime. In a light sense, of course. This time, the Bangalore Literature Fest has added a pinch of fantasy to its mix. Introducing our eminent speakers on the dais, we have with us Anita Nair, who is the best-selling author of The Better Man, Ladies Coupe, Mistress and the Lessons in Forgetting, and Cut Like Wound. Her books have been translated into over 30 languages all around the world. Her new novel, Idris, will be published in November 2013. We welcome you, ma'am. May we have a round of applause for her? Next, we have with us on stage Madhulika Liddle, a novelist and an award-winning short story writer who lives in New Delhi. She is best known as the author of the Muzaffar Jung series. She writes in a variety of genres, including dark humor and crime. We welcome you, ma'am. We also have with us today Ms. Nilanjana Roy, a journalist, literary critic, and author of The Wildings. She currently writes a regular column for the Business Standard. She used to write a notorious literary blog called Kitab Khana under the pseudonym Hari Babu. As our moderator for the session, we have with us Mr. Sumeet Shetty, who is a bookworm and the member of the SAP's book reading club, which has so far invited writers with varied tastes and outlook, either in its Bangalore or its Gurgaon office. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you all for being here, ladies and gentlemen. I thought I had perfectly funny introductions to all three authors here, but my friend here has just outdone me. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of these authors that has not already been said. About Madhulika Liddle, I'd like to say that apart from being famous for Muzaffar Jung, I've greatly enjoyed her short stories, especially one called Love and the Papaya Man, which I'm going to evangelize today. Nilanjana Roy not only writes about cats, but she's also a cat herself. I found this out at the Hindu Literature Festival earlier this year, where I found her gazing very wistfully at a tree. And when I asked her what was going on in her mind, she said, if only I wasn't wearing a sari, I would love to climb the tree. So Nilanjana, we have a lot of trees for you in Bangalore. Welcome. Anita Nair is Nama Bengaluru's favorite author. She recently won the Sahitya Academy's Bal Puraskar Award. So if you haven't read Adventures of Nono the Skating Squirrel, now's the time to do it. So Madhulika, Anita, and Nilanjana, welcome. Welcome all of you to this discussion on crime fiction and fantasy. We are your partners in crime fiction and fantasy for the afternoon. I'm going to start the session off by quoting Sherlock Holmes from The Adventure of the Norwood Builder. And he says, and I quote, "From the point of view of the criminal expert, London has become a singularly uninteresting city since the death of the late lamented Professor Moriarty." And then Watson chimes in by saying, I can hardly think that you would find many decent citizens to agree with you, Holmes. Unquote. And yet, crime fascinates all of us. And we continue to read both fiction and non-fiction about crime. So my first question to this distinguished panel here today, maybe to Nilanjana first, is why, oh why, does crime fascinate all of us so much? And why, after so many years since the advent of modern crime fiction or detective fiction, are we still reading about crime?
Okay, this is really an audience question. Isn't there somebody you wanted to murder at some point of time? I mean, the impulse runs strong and true in our blood, and we deny it greatly. But I think people talk about how satisfying it is to read detective fiction because in the end there's a certain degree of morality. It's the one area where order is imposed over chaos and where, by and large, evil loses, right? I don't think it's that at all. I just think that we like corpses. But you should be asking the two experts on the panel, really.
Let's bring in Anita Nair on this.
I think it's primarily because, you know, all of us have this great streak of curiosity in us. And something about detective fiction, I mean, crime fiction, kind of spurs that on. You know, you start reading, and then you know that at some point things are going to change, and you can't put the book down because of that. When you say a book is unputdownable, that is primarily the reason, because you're curious to know what happens next. And I think the other element is that we live in a world of such uncertainties. The one thing you can be certain about in a crime fiction is that everything is resolved in the end. So it's a great sense of, you know, you feel validated in life, that good prevails and evil is destroyed, etc. So it is kind of, to some extent, comfort reading.
What do you think, Madhulika?
I'd agree with what Anita and Nilanjana said, but I'd add one more thing, and that is that detective fiction, I think, is a good challenge to the reader. It involves the reader, because if you're reading the book and it's well written, you're actually already trying to figure out who's done it. You know, if it's well written, because a good detective story would have the correct clues everywhere. So I think it's very involving as well.
I want to talk a little bit about the genesis of modern crime fiction. In the beginning, modern crime fiction was very nice and clean. The murder rarely happened before your eyes. There was very little explicit description of blood and gore. The detectives used their gray cells to solve the crimes. How has crime fiction changed in the years since the advent of this kind of fiction? Unbelievable fiction where you had a superhuman detective with a superhuman mind who could solve crimes.
I think what changed is, as human beings, we changed, and technology happened. And somehow, you know, and look at television also, you know, everything that you see there in terms of crime, you have a whole channel dedicated to crime. So it's not that we live in a world where we are unaware of how these things happen. And so if you need to keep the reader reading, then a certain degree of explicitness has to come into the writing so that the reader feels that he's part of the experience. You're competing with CSI. So I guess, you know, I mean, CSI is very clinical, if you ask me. I personally, myself, prefer some nice blood and gore. It just, the sense of gratification, you know, when I read that. So I think that, for me, is what has changed, that the style of writing has changed. You know, I don't think the crime solvers, in terms of how they use their mind, has changed. It probably has just, the language has changed, the way they kind of arrive at a solution, because you have crime profiling now. So that has changed. But otherwise, if you look at the writing itself, probably because of the times these earlier books were written, if you take, say, an Agatha Christie, and if you take a novel that is written now, you can see that great distinct difference, that an Agatha Christie is something, is a book that probably, I mean, all of us loved reading Agatha Christie, but at this point of time in our lives, would we read an Agatha Christie again? I'm not so sure about it.
I want to bring in Nilanjana on the same question.
Okay, more seriously, I would agree that we are moving into a more realistic understanding of the chaos that rules society now. Agatha Christie and the rest of them, they worked in a very ordered world with narrow frameworks. But I'd also like to make the argument that with crime, with modern crime, what we're doing is really going back to the roots of crime fiction. Huh? Because when you look at the epics, which is where it all starts out, which is where the blood and the guts starts from, one of the oldest epics in the English language is Beowulf, which has the monster being, in effect, unseated from his own house by this bunch of marauding strangers whom he then proceeds to kill. And there is no choice except to kill him. It's kill or be killed. And it's an incredibly bloody primal conflict, if you think about it. If you go back to our own epics as well, there's no lack of blood. There's no lack of the understanding that murder is ultimately a brutal thing. It's not just a sin against the order of nature. It's a violation because it tears apart the body. And you have that in everything from the Norse epics, to even our own epics, whether it's the Ramayana and the Mahabharata or other stories in the Vedas and the Purans, that understanding that human beings ultimately are geared to be bloody and that half of our fight, half of our lives, is actually reigning in those impulses, So the British came in briefly and they managed to impose a certain level of gardening over all of this. But I think if you look at what was happening around the same time at Nordic fiction, Nordic crime fiction, they remained sharply aware that it was not pretty, that a lot of the crime that was happening involved children, or it involved a serial killer who was distributing heads, around a winter landscape, that sort of thing. They didn't hide that. I think we've just come to the point where we're happy not to do that. But there are advantages, aren't there, to going the other way and to preserving some of the other tradition of writing about crime.
I'm curious to know, as readers, do you remember your first foray into reading crime fiction? Which was the first notable work of crime fiction that you remember reading? And the reason I asked this question is when I asked this question to myself, my first answer was The Empty House, which is actually in The Return of Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle. But later on, I revised my answer when I realized that it was actually Enid Blyton. Yeah, Island is also really crime fiction, although one might not consider it crime fiction.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with Enid Blyton. But I think after that, it would be Sherlock Holmes. Okay. Which book, I don't remember.
I think for me, it was Earl Stanley Gardner, Perry Mason. Because, I had an older brother, so everything he read, I read. So I don't know how much I understood of it when I was reading it. It's just that, I loved the way that Perry Mason's assistant, Drake, he would call women dame. And I used to think, oh, wow. I used to like that. So I think it began with him.
Yeah, for me, there were two languages happening more or less simultaneously. In Bengali, there was a detective who was famous at that time called Feluda, and who wrote what you might consider clean crime, I mean, it was very sanitized, bodies were tucked neatly out of sight, but it was perfect for a child to read. And at the same time, I remember reading some really gory Russian stuff. This was the era when Delhi and large parts of India were also flooded with Soviet books. So as much as we were growing up reading Enid Blyton, the other side of it was that we were also reading people called Olga Perevskaya, and we were reading the Dostoevskys and all of that. In fact, I think the first one that I read about crime fiction that stays with me was Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Right. And it stays with me because he describes that actual moment of the murder so brutally, the old woman's skull cracking. And I was probably way too young to read it anyway, about 6 or 7. But for years after that, I'd look at my grandmother's friends, and I wouldn't actually be able to look at their heads because I'd think of the sound of a stick or a cudgel coming down on their skulls. I was that kind of child, what can I say?
While you were reading crime fiction as readers, what was the point at which you started questioning the detective or the crime or the solution to the crime? Because a lot of it, and the session is called Partners in Crime and Fantasy, a lot of early crime writing was fantasy, wasn't it? You had impossible villages with countless killers. You had characters with fantastic names. You had impossible detectives who couldn't really exist in real life. So was there a point at which, after enjoying a certain kind of fiction, you started questioning it and saying, okay, this is not realistic?
No. See, for me, the thing was, I gave up reading crime a long time ago. And then it was only after I finished writing my first crime novel, which was a completely whimsical thing to do, that I went back to reading crime fiction. So there was no point where I started questioning the modus operandi or wondering about how the crime solver did whatever he did, whether it was a detective or, whoever. Someone like a Hercule Poirot, or it could be somebody else like a Miss Marple, or it could be, Sherlock Holmes. At that point of my life, when I was reading them, which was in school, I just completely took it as granted that these people know what they're doing and they would do it very effectively. I guess questioning happens when you get a little more older and you are in sync with what is happening around you, and then you start wondering how and what and etc. But by that time, I'd given up reading crime fiction. So there was no problem for me at all until now, when I got back to, when I started writing and then I got back to reading, that I started asking myself, like, okay, how much of, now when I read crime fiction, I see how novelists take a great effort to make sure that absolutely no element of fantasy creeps in. I'm reading Henning Mankell at this point, and the prose is so spare. He makes sure that you don't at any point of time wonder, is this real? Is this cooked up? How much of it will happen in this world, etc. So I guess probably Nilanjana or Madhulika, who probably have read more crime fiction, should answer this.
When it comes to me, I don't think I'm a very good a responder for this question, because I think for the past 20 odd years, almost all the crime fiction that I've read is historical detective fiction, which is, and I'll explain it over here, it's fiction which is written by contemporary authors, but is set in a historical period, which by that itself, you can tell that it's set in a period which is not probably familiar to most of the readers. So for instance, if you're writing a book which is set in ancient Rome or ancient Greece, or as I write, in Mughal Delhi, there's a lot of fabrication there. So I've come to the point where I accept it. I say, okay, yes, this is how it happened. It may not be real. It may be just based on fact, on research. But I accept it, and I don't question it, actually. I never get to the point of thinking that this is fantasy.
My next question is specifically to Nilanjana. The eccentric amateur detective C. Auguste Dupin debuted in 1841, if I remember it correctly, and that was, I think, a full 46 and a half years before Sherlock Holmes. He's considered the definitive modern detective. Yeah, by a lot of people. A lot of people even think that he's superior to Sherlock Holmes in many ways. He's considered the original master of rational deduction or ratiocination. What is the unique position of Dupin in detective crime fiction? You've written about this, and I specifically direct this question to you.
In some ways, he invented a lot of the conventions. And to begin with, he invented the basic idea on which a lot of crime fiction is based, which is the simple, almost childlike belief that you can think your way past the most evil of human impulses. I went back to reading Edgar Allan Poe and a lot of the early crime writers, along with, around the same time that I was reading a lot of Gothic horror fiction, and oddly enough, a lot of war, Holocaust fiction at the same time. And the three of them were connected in a strange way by evil, basically, by the notion of evil lurking. All that happened was that in different times, if you're doing a ghost story, for example, what you're saying, in effect, is that you think that the evil that people create, or the badness, the horror, the real horror of the human condition, is actually all around us. It might come from whatever you call ghosts, but it's there, it's at a safe remove from our world. But the fear of the haunted house, or the very American serial killer coming out of that lonely house, it's really a fear of what homes contain, right? And what, on the other hand, what Poe was doing was to take worlds that in some ways were actually terrifying. Whether you lived in France or whether you live in India now or in Mughal times, an Indian city now, for example, or the Mughal period that Madhulika writes about, actually has a lot in common, in the sense that they are places of deep chaos, and there's a great deal of elegance coming together with an enormous amount of casual bloodiness, right? And that was actually the France that the Poe's detective came out of. And what he was doing was offering a kind of hope that you saw later in the superhero, you know? And that hope said, maybe somebody can make sense of this. Maybe the one thing that you have to throw at the problem of evil is just the power of your mind. When later, you know, when you come to war journalism and all of that, what you have is something that goes completely against the conventions of crime fiction, because what war journalism and what war fiction says is nobody escapes the taint. The lovely thing about the detective novel is that somebody does, and that's usually the detective himself or herself. You know, that there's that one person who is clean and who's above it all, and whom, in a way, you can trust in. I don't know whether this makes sense, but it might too. These two, because they've actually read far more in that direction and written a lot more about it. But I think we put detectives in the same position as priests. I mean, this is a very old observation, and it's not really mine. Oh, by the way, if anybody is feeling uncomfortable, particularly in the front rows, if you're getting the sun, there's a row of chairs out here, and you might just want to put them in front of the stage and come up and be more comfortable. Anyway. But, I mean, that's it. I mean, I just think that he was the first to invent the detective as this figure of relative cleanliness, you know? This person who was above the fray, not touched by the blood, by the corpses, by the death around him. And if you think about it, in France at that time, to have immunity to death was a very big thing.
I think some revisions to detective history are now needed, both in terms of whether Sherlock Holmes was the first consulting detective or whether Auguste Dupin was the first, was the precursor to all detective fiction, because you have Muzaffar Jung, and he's a 17th century detective. So, Madhulika, tell us a little bit more about him.
Well, Muzaffar Jung is 17th century, but there are a lot of historical detectives which predate him. So the thing was that when I was about 13, I read this book called The Chinese Maze Murders by Robert van Gulik, who was a Dutch diplomat, who was posted in China, posted in Delhi also for a while. And while in China, he did a lot of, he studied Chinese, and he became quite an expert on Chinese detective fiction. And apparently they had these entire detective novels where a lot of fantasy was a part of. The detective was helped out by spirits and stuff like that. So Robert van Gulik took the core elements, the crime and stuff, and molded it to a contemporary mid-20th century audience. So gave the detective actually intelligence rather than spiritual help. And I read that book, and I was floored. I was like won over for life by historical detectives. And I read a lot, I've read detectives who are from across time and space, ancient Rome, ancient Greek, Tsarist Russia, everything. And I realized there were no Indians. And especially considering we have such a rich historical background, that seemed to be something that it needed to be done. And that's how Muzaffar Jung happened.
I was speaking to Madhulika earlier today, and I told her that once you start writing detective fiction, I think you start introducing mysteries even in your work, which is not necessarily categorized as detective fiction. So I talked about this short story called Love and the Papaya Man. So that's a good, let's say, cue, or that if that doesn't pique your curiosity to read the short story, then nothing will. Read it. We started off this session with a quote by Sherlock Holmes, and I want to bring in Anita now. What is it about Sherlock Holmes that is so enduring that even after so many years, there are Sherlock Holmes societies mushrooming every year in every part of the world? In fact, there are, I know of certain attempts to form a Sherlock Holmes society in Bangalore right now, as we speak. And there are countless television serials, there are movies, they are prestigious. What is it about Holmes that is so sticky that none of us are able to forget him?
I think probably it has to do with the character itself. It's not the cases he solved. I mean, if you ask anybody, unless you're like a dedicated Arthur Conan Doyle fan, if you were to ask someone, name 6 Sherlock Holmes novels you've read, or 6 Sherlock Holmes stories, I mean, I for one can just remember Hound of Baskerville simply because my dog used to be called that. My father's name is Bhaskaran. So, my class used to call, have fun calling my dog that. Because of that, I remember that title. But apart from that, I wouldn't remember a thing, really, and that classic phrase, elementary Watson. But the character itself, the character is what sticks on, endures, and that is what I think continues to make Sherlock Holmes such a joy to read. Because, this is this laconic man, professional person, and to some extent, the loner, all of which, when you're reading, most people, and I realized that most people, when they're reading, place themselves in the place of the hero. I mean, you could be 23 years old or you could be 95 years old, it doesn't matter. But at that point of time when you're reading, you are the same age as the hero. You're the same person. You just kind of enter the skin of the hero and then you identify so closely with him that, you start loving the hero of the book. And I think that is what happened with Sherlock Holmes. Everyone who reads Sherlock Holmes at some point or the other falls in love with the character. And then thereafter, anything that he does is fine. You just want to know more about him because it's, again, a very self-gratifying experience, really.
Nilanjana, what do you think? A lot of us grew up wanting to be Sherlock Holmes, not knowing that the job was already taken.
Well, I'm so glad that we didn't actually, because if you look at the man, he was a raving drug addict, He worked in fits and starts. He had all the signs that tell you that he was a nervous, highly temperamental artist, probably unpleasant to be around. This disturbed me deeply when I was reading the Sherlock Holmes stories and I was immersed in them. I never figured out whether he was actually a good violinist or not. And I thought that at some point of time we should be told, And he would have made such an annoying conversationalist, because he knew everything. And what is more annoying than somebody at that, like that if you're facing them over dinner. But I think subtly what we were tuning into was he was not Marple and Poirot. He was not from a safe, in that sense, respectable world. He wasn't, he was a lot closer in a strange way, I think, to Chandler's Bad Boys, even though he wasn't the man who actually walked down those mean streets. There was a distinct sense that he definitely knew what those mean streets was about. He'd been to hell and back anyway. And somehow if you're going to make a trip into hell, you trust somebody who knows the way, who has the route map. When I was much older, I think I rationalized all of this. But I think at the time when I was a kid, I liked Sherlock Holmes a lot because he wasn't a good adult. He wasn't a role model by any means. And I really, instinctively, subtly, I got that message. Arthur Conan Doyle, I suspect, secretly wanted to be him. He wrote a lot about white knights, and he wrote a lot about, medieval people who were the flower of chastity. And I suspect that there was this side of him that really just wanted to let it go and see what cocaine was like.
I'm wondering whether Sherlock Holmes works so well for us also because of the literary device that Conan Doyle used in Watson. And Watson is as beloved to a lot of people as Holmes is. In fact, John Le Carre, in this introduction to the 150th anniversary of the annotated Sherlock Holmes, says that Watson doesn't write to you. He speaks to you with Edwardian courtesy across a glowing fire. So how important is Watson in making Holmes loved?
All right. Okay. See, Watson, I think, is this perfect stooge. He doesn't really have a mind of his own. I mean, he just listens on, and everybody wants a stooge in their life. And so Watson is, you like the idea of somebody who is all the time, I think, mesmerized by everything that Sherlock Holmes is, divulging or pontificating at various points, whatever he's doing. And Watson seldom has a counterpoint. I don't remember all that well, but I don't remember him actually standing up and saying, no, you got it wrong completely. Because eventually he's convinced. So to some extent, I think Watson becomes an other part of us. On the one side, we are Sherlock Holmes, solving the murders brilliantly, or whatever cases brilliantly. and Watson is the other perspective of how it is done. And we can also slip into the skin of Watson and allow ourselves to be enchanted, mesmerized, all those things, that Arthur Conan Doyle takes you through while you read his writing. So I think to some extent, when you realize that you haven't got the person right, whoever committed the crime, Watson hasn't either. So you think like, it also allows you to feel that you're not so stupid. Because Watson, who's in close association with Sherlock Holmes, and some of it should have rubbed off on him, hasn't managed to crack it, so why would you? I just think I'm analyzing, okay, I don't know how right that is. But I think that's what it is. And like you said, like John Locke said, I mean, he is so courteous. He's this complete opposite to Sherlock Holmes, who was much more contrarian in that sense. So he's this very pleasant guy that you just want to have around to take away some of the sting of Sherlock Holmes.
It's all very well to want to or to be a detective in a novel, but I'm wondering, coming back to real life, why would anybody choose to be a private investigator in real life? What kind of motivation would it involve? What kind of logistics? What kind of a career path? Why does Muzaffar Jang get into detection, and what's Inspector Boregowda's intrinsic motivation for doing what he does?
Okay, Muzaffar gets into investigation because of a friend of his who is wrongly accused of a crime, and Muzaffar is certain that this guy didn't do the crime. And so just to save his friend, he decides to try and figure out what actually happened. And that's how he gets into it, and he finds it's interesting. So that's how it sort of, it's not really quite in his control, the way his career builds. And after a while, he starts realizing that he's actually good at it. So that's how it happens.
Okay, Boregowda is not a private investigator. He's a police inspector.
Exactly.
And he gets into the police service for several reasons. One, because he is a very kind of physical kind of a person who likes doing things rather than sitting in a teller's cage and counting out money. And he also believes, some part of him believes that he can make a difference, that he can change the way policing is done. And he begins off with this great illusion of being able to be a good policeman. He doesn't come into the world of policing to solve crimes, but to be this public service citizen, that kind of a person. So there is no element of, like, say, a Sherlock Holmes or, say, a Hercule Poirot. I won't say Miss Marple, but these two who feel driven to go out and find out what happened. To Boregowda, it is initially a part of what he does. At some point in his career, he realizes that he's able to do things. He probably is able to he has an intuitive sense of being able to figure out how things happen. He's able to see patterns. He's able to make connections. And then, it's once you know the taste of success, he wants to do more. So that's how he is born as an investigator.
Nilanjana, did you at any point in your life want to be a private investigator yourself?
No, and I'm at a slight disadvantage out here because I have to say that the cats and the wildings do absolutely no investigating at all. I mean, I don't think any of them have the detective instinct, though they do have the hunting and killing instinct. I mean, they're pretty savage when it comes to mice. And there is one character in that book whom would be an excellent private investigator if she could stand still. And that's a mongoose who more or less lives for blood, guts, and...
Kiri.
Kiri, the mongoose. She was named on Twitter, actually, which is one of the reasons why I'm very fond of her. I got a little stuck and I didn't have a proper name that was mongoose enough, and that was killer enough. And I threw it open to Twitter, and it was actually somebody from Bangalore who gave me the name. But Kiri, one of the things about her that comes through towards the end of the book is, despite being a very savage predator, And I don't know whether you've ever seen a mongoose actually take down its prey, but they're totally focused. There's no question of looking left, right. They are the last gunslingers left. She also has a sense of justice. She has a sense of proportion about how much killing is appropriate. And she really disapproves of animals who overstep the line, and she makes sure that, in that sense, she hunts them down a little like an old-fashioned Clint Eastwood, if nothing else.
What I actually meant was, at any point in your life, did you want to be a private investigator yourself?
I would say that all writers share that instinct in one way, whether they're honest about it or not, which is that, in effect, one of the things that I really love about crime fiction, I think that was the way that I understood death, as a tremendous invasion of privacy. It's the one reason I have not to die gruesomely in a murder with an axe sticking out of my ribs, because I wouldn't want somebody actually going through my papers and my stuff at all. It's a good reason to lead a clean life. But for writers, I think we like the permission to look around, the permission to actually think about people and why they do the stuff that they do. That's attractive.
I just want to get comments from all three panelists about a comment made by Raymond Chandler in his seminal essay, The Simple Art of Murder, where he rules about the fact that crime fiction novels with titles like The Triple Petunia Murder Case and Inspector Pinchbottle to the Rescue, titles like these fly off the shelves, while really important books languish on dusty bookshelves. So is it a valid criticism of crime fiction that it impels so many people to read it that really serious and important works of literature are ignored?
Yeah, but what are these serious and important works, really, my take is that when I've read the best of crime fiction, some of it written by people in this country, possibly even on this panel, it does pretty much the same thing that you want from good literary fiction. It asks a lot of questions. Ideally, it makes you a little uncomfortable. You don't just arrive at the solution neatly. There's a process and what you're engaged in, even though, technically you could say that all crime fiction has the same plot. Boy meets girl, both of them get gruesomely killed, somebody figures out who the murderer is, the end. The truth is that you're interested in the journey on that way. And the best of crime fiction writers have been right up there. I used to be part of the Give Jean Le Carre the Nobel Prize brigade, because I didn't see why somebody should be disqualified just on account of genre. And if you're talking about crime fiction being literary, I would make a huge case for George R.R. Martin, We've seen the Game of Thrones series unfold, and that's on the cusp of crime fiction and fantasy, if you like. And to me, just to be alive at the same time that series is coming out is as epic and in its own way as being alive in the same time that John Coetzee is writing. It feels as much part of the history of literature, So I would make a case for not separating the two that much. Of course, there's a lot of crime fiction that's average. But there's a lot of literary fiction that's downright mediocre as well, so if we're being honest about it.
Anita, my next question is for you. Is it true that to write crime fiction or the detective story, even in its conventional form, is quite challenging? You just said that you got into writing Cut Like Wound more on a whim than anything else. Was it a more difficult project than your earlier works, or more challenging in some ways?
Yes, because one, of course, is that I'm someone who's quite a Nazi about research, So unless I know everything about it, I can't write about it. So which I didn't really have to do with probably all my other novels, really, where, I do try and find out everything about it, but not to the extent that I had to research Cut Like Wound, because it also meant that with the other novels that I wrote, I could access information on my own. But here, so much of it was classified that I had to go finding connections who would help me walk into a police station or meet a policeman, a senior police person who would be able to help me, with my research, etc. So to that extent, that part of it was challenging. The other part of it was to make sure that the pace didn't lag at any point. Now, as a writer of literary fiction, I'm given to dwelling on the mindscapes of my characters. In a crime novel, sometimes that doesn't work. You know, you have to balance the mindscape with the action so that there's something that is constantly happening. I mean, that is the rule of the genre. I mean, and you can't say things like there are no such rules, because then, you know, your books are not going to fly off the shelves. So, so if you're getting into the genre, then you have to kind of go with the karmic flow of that genre.
Madhulika, how was it for you to write the series of novels with Muzaffar Jung? Was research also an issue, and did you find the genre especially challenging?
Yeah, I find the genre still challenging because doing plotting for a detective novel, especially in a detective novel which is set in a period when you didn't have forensic sciences at the sort of level which they are now, can be pretty difficult, because you have to, you know, all the paraphernalia of clues and red herrings, etc., etc. All of that, and of course the fact that my setting was Mughal Delhi, or Mughal India now, because I've moved on from Delhi as well. Doing the research and getting it right was, it's taken a huge amount of time. It's actually, I've been doing it for like maybe 10 years now. And it's only now that it's actually, I've managed to sort of imbibe it, and I don't have to do fresh research each time I write a book. So yes, the research is a very major part of it.
You know, I read in the pages of mainstream newspaper recently that death delights the average woman, since it's one way to deal with issues that plague her. Demanding husbands, annoying bosses, irritating friends. And the best solution to all of these things is to escape into a world where all these annoyances die, especially gory deaths. And then blood becomes as desirable as that perfect red lipstick. We have 3 women here, and let's hear it from them if this is true.
Well, I don't know why people call women the gentlest sex. There's nothing especially gentle or savage about us. I mean, I suspect we'd be pretty good at savagery if we were given a chance in a kingdom. But, I mean, if you're asking about the book specifically, the world of the Wildings is very different from crime fiction. You know, it isn't controlled by the same kind of morality, and that was really about being a little less apist, if I might say so. You know, we spend a lot of time in this world looking at things through human eyes. And for me, what was interesting about doing that book was actually getting away and trying to make cats plausible, or trying to look at cities and say, well, we're not the only people who live here. Typically, you know, when you look out on the lawns, what you're measuring is the number of people sitting under the trees and the chairs, but you're not looking at the birds and saying that, okay, they share the same space, so they might be listening. And the moment I started walking into that world, what I realized is that it is immediately savage. It isn't savage because the cats themselves are savage, but it is savage because the cats inhabit a human world by sufferance. And their lives are circumscribed by a lot of the things that we wouldn't even notice. We wouldn't even notice that we were being cruel if we cut off an animal's feeding zone or something of the sort. And it's the bonds that they form. A lot of the Wildings grew out of just one image, which was watching the cats from my veranda and then following them down into the park, and then eventually getting friendly enough with them to go with them across the canal, where I discovered that the cats of Nizamuddin were actually friends with the pigs. And the pigs had actually developed a way of sharing food with the cheels. And I was suddenly looking at something that was so... Humans were acknowledged, and humans were sometimes feared and sometimes befriended, less rarely. But this was entirely an animal world on my doorstep in the middle of the city. And at that point of time, I think you have the same instinct that you might with crime fiction or anything else, which is simply to say, how can you not write about this, you know? I think the sad part about writing about cats is something that doesn't really come through in either The Wildings or its sequel, The 100 Names of Darkness, which is that most stray animals have very short lives, if we're talking nasty, brutal, and murderous. Most urban animals don't really live that long. And for the sake of the plot and for the sake of readers' feelings, I cut a lot of that out. I gave them maybe 6 years or 10 years more than they would have on the streets. Which is, if you think about it, what the detective does. He comes back with hope. He says that, well, there might be that many corpses around Mughal India or around, any Indian city. And we still have a way through. We still have hope. We still think that we can solve this one.
If you're sitting in the audience and wondering, this session was called Partners in Crime and Fantasy, and so far we did the crime bit. What about the fantasy bit? We're getting to it right now. We have 3. This is my last question before we take audience questions. 3 beautiful women here. Let's ask them if they've ever fantasized about killing somebody in real life. And let's also ask them that if the answer is yes, what was going to be your weapon or poison of choice? We'll start with Anita.
Why me? Okay, right. Well, I haven't really fantasized about killing anyone. But if I were to kill someone, I know what I'd do. I'd get mushrooms. Because, you don't know how many of those are edible, really. And make a really nice mushroom omelette and feed it to the person. Give it to them with a glass of wine. So, make it a nice, happy ending, for everybody.
Nilanjana.
The last time we met, she invited me over for dinner. This is running. But I thought that the simplest way to do it, actually, would be to feed somebody you disliked very much or had got on your nerves to a friendly crocodile, which are not that hard to find. In Delhi, if you go to Lucknow, for example, there's a gharial reserve out there. The gharials are very friendly. The adult crocodiles, if they sense that you're the kind who might either slide down the banks or be gently pushed, are willing to consider a change of plans for dinner. And, that way you dispose of the evidence neatly. You have a happy crocodile. I see this as a win-win situation.
We're discovering whole new truths about our friendly authors here. Madhulika, the world is waiting to hear.
My goodness. I'd probably use some sort of plant poison. Similar to the mushrooms, but maybe something more potent, like oleander. Which just a little bit of sap. And oleander is like all over Delhi. Rubbed on a wound and...
Did you ever want to kill someone?
Well, I wanted to kill about 50 people on the flight from Delhi this morning. So I don't think oleander would have worked for all of them, but yeah.
What was it that Kipling said about the female of the species being more deadly than the male? Good point to take audience questions. If you have a question, raise your hand and we'll get a mic over to you. There's one question right over here.
Hi, this question goes to all 3 of you, actually. We were talking about fantasy and fiction, but because it's crime fiction, although it is set in real time, most of it, do you think that it needs to be a little more realistic because it kind of goes away from the realms of realistic literature? Do you think there is a need for crime fiction to be more realistic?
In my case, I can't get any more realistic. It's there. It's precisely, it's set in Bangalore, it's set in, everything about it is based on how things happen in this city, how things happen in police stations in this city. So as far as I'm concerned, I can't get any more realistic. It would be beyond me to do that.
As far as I'm concerned, the way I write, it has to be a certain element of imagination. But I try and make it as realistic as possible because I do a lot of research. So that's there.
Any other questions?
I'm actually kind of mystified that I'm not hearing any sympathy for the anti-hero here. And I just want to put it to you. Do you think it's plausible? Do you think it falls within, the moral framework of crime fiction? That you could have a villain, say, happily disappearing into the distance at the end. Is that doable, or does that militate against the very bounds of what you write within?
Okay, can I answer that to some extent? Even though I didn't do crime fiction, I do have a character in the book who's about as evil as they get. He's a cat who's gone feral and who has world domination plans and who's not kind who's really not kind to little animals. But the point is that while I was writing that character, he came out of a newspaper report about a woman who lived in a house all by herself, and when that was opened up, they found almost 300 animals out there, and the animals had gone crazy. And while I was writing this, I walked down to the local animal shelter and met a couple of feral cats who'd coincidentally been brought in at that point of time. And over a period of time, I think what struck me with some sadness was that while they never responded, they'd been feral all their lives, they'd been locked up and, been left wild at the same time, which is a terrible thing to do to any animal. They were dangerous. They would take off your hand as soon as they'd look at you. And they never changed that part of it. But you also felt so sorry for them because you saw something in their eyes that just said, we didn't choose to be this way, but we don't know any other way to be. And ultimately, I guess that's what your villain might be about.
Actually, in my novel, Cut Like Wound, the person gets away with it. Because, there are maybe chances, maybe the person might be discovered, etc. But that's kind of left unsaid. I mean, chances are it may not happen because he's kind of laid it out in such a fashion that everybody who comes there assumes that the other person is the murderer. So I guess it is possible. It is also done. And I think to the writer, it's great fun to do that because, you kind of get this feeling that, okay, I didn't give them a pat ending. You did kind of leave it nebulous to that extent.
There's a question at the back. Could we get a mic over to him, please? Anybody else who has questions, just put up your hand now. A couple of will come to you.
This question is for each of the writers. I would like to know your individual opinion about the future of crime fiction in India, English writing in crime fiction. I mean, since you are already there.
I just hope it grows. In fact, I've seen a lot of growth. My first Muzaffar Jung book was published in 2009. And at that time, it was, there was this huge flurry of newspaper interviews. Everybody wanted to interview me because I was a crime writer. And I was like, well, yeah, so I am a crime writer. So, but you were one of the very few people who's writing crime. But now there are a lot. And I can see that there's, as Piyush and I were discussing earlier today, we were talking about how there are different types of crime writing coming up in India. So there's a spy thriller, there's the political thriller, there's stuff on embezzlement and banks and stuff like that. So we are branching out into subgenres. And that's what I think is something that should be, there's space for it. And I think it should be definitely encouraged. People should have the courage to also go for it.
I have a question here. This is to all of you. So as a reader of crime and thrillers, sometimes I'm disappointed, probably because of too many loopholes in the story and the ending was illogical, or sometimes the suspense is very weak and it was very predictable. So as a writer, how do you make sure that the audience is just intrigued and not disappointed or bored?
I guess, I think to most writers, they're their first readers themselves. So every time you think that whatever, what do you call it? Which is why you plant red herrings, because you don't want it to be so, you don't want the reader to get to the point of discovery too quickly. You don't want them to kind of figure it out by page 3. So you need to kind of plant red herrings, and you make sure that you insert certain conflicting bits. At the same time, you also drop in really large clues, and then you hope that the reader is suitably confused so that they don't know who the person is, whether it's the embezzler, whether it's the murderer, whether it's the rapist, whoever. You just kind of create a number of suspects. You create alternate alibis. So all of it, which will suitably, I think, confuse the reader. That is what you do.
Yeah, we spoke about Agatha Christie. You spoke about Agatha Christie and her world of sort of cozy murders. Do you think that world is over completely? Because a lot of us look back on that world with a lot of fondness. But of course, you know, as crime fiction evolved, it became more realistic. Police procedurals became, you know, kind of the norm. But do you, you know, since we were talking about an overlap between crime and fantasy, and somebody here mentioned that, you know, that is kind of a fantasy world, do you think there is any way that, you know, that can come back now, or do we live in too complex a world for that kind of mystery to ever be a success?
See, as far as I would see it, you know, I can't speak for the other panelists, but I would think that we could go back to that kind of a situation only with a certain degree of nostalgia. You know, it's where you tell yourself, okay, I'm going to be reading a book that is set in 1950s or in 1940s, and this is what they had. So it's period writing, really. But we can't go back to that kind of cozy, happy, clinical, sanitized murder mysteries like we had when we read Agatha Christie.
Hello. Usually, writer is not a crime doer. Then, actually, are you writing with doing crime or enjoying by writing? Or I will give you a simple example for this one. A swimmer, he knows how to swim. But a writer, he wrote many books on swimming, but he doesn't know how to swim it. But why I am telling no? You people are writing, actually. Theoretically, you may be imagining something else and you may write. But do you mean that you have experienced that one? No. I think you are not. But imagination is entirely different from the doing the crime. Because I will question another thing to our sir. That is, he told about that lipstick. Actually, lipstick is used for different people, for different dresses and different taste and all. It is not at all red. The blood is red for everyone. It is same, one and same, for men or women or any religion, anything. Anybody. As a professor, what I am telling now, those things are not comparable. Crime is going on. Crime in the sense, basically in the olden days, since the birth of this word, crime is there.
So what you're saying basically is that there's a huge gulf between the writer's experience and what they write about. You know, that's a major question.
Major question.
Yeah.
Then not only that.
Because, you know, sorry, I think we're going to have to cut this session because we're almost out of time. But just to answer this at some speed, one is that if writers stuck to what they knew about, you would have a lot of really, really bad books out there about going for a walk and getting the shopping done and washing clothes, you know, by and large. And the second thing is you are absolutely right. You have found us out. We are frauds because we spend our life making things up.
And I also agree that lipstick is available in many shades other than red. Now, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here today. I think we got to know these three ladies much better today. So if you get invited to Anita Nair's home and she offers to serve you mushrooms, or if Nilanjana offers to show you her pet crocodile, or if Madhulika says anything with the word oleander in it, you know what to do. Thank you. You've been a fantastic audience. Thank you, Nilanjana. Thank you, Anita. Thank you, Madhulika.